Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Energy MD podcast, where we help you resolve your chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME/CFS, and long COVID by working on the real root causes, which are what I call the toxic five, a combination of heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, and nervous system dysfunction or trauma, so that you can live your best life. So I'm really excited today because we're going to be talking about the role of fasting and diet in long COVID with my new friend, Dr. Thomas Bunker. So let's learn a little bit about him. So Dr. Thomas Bunker is a PhD immunologist from UC Davis and has been a COVID-19 long hauler since 2020. Drawing on his expertise, Dr. Bunker founded the Facebook group Long COVID, Improve via Fasting/Autophagy in December 2020, where he shares insights on managing long COVID symptoms through intermittent fasting. He is currently running a clinical trial titled Diet and Fasting for Long COVID, which explores dietary interventions and fasting as potential treatments for the condition. His innovative work seeks to unravel the benefits of autophagy and metabolic health in mitigating long COVID symptoms. Thomas, thanks so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, in your bio, we mentioned a lot of words, and some of them people may not be familiar with. So, I think maybe we start with autophagy. Can you tell us what autophagy is?
Yes, autophagy is basically it's fundamentally a response to a wide variety of cell stresses. So it's an ancient conserved process, and basically it is a deep, like an internal deep house cleaning or a reset and repair. I mean, a simple analogy would be like your laptop has a major problem and you can't fix it and you restart. That's kind of like what autophagy is in the cell. Basically, there's a wide variety of things that can get damaged in the cell, including our sensitive mitochondria. And autophagy has these really cool, complicated mechanisms to like take rusty, damaged, leaky mitochondria and degrade them and recycle the basic components, and then they're used to build new ones, shiny new ones.
Excellent. So, what are some of the mechanisms that we have to improve our autophagy or increase it?
Well, there, I mean, the basic research around autophagy is amazing. I think there's like over 80,000 basic research papers on autophagy, but most of that is in cell culture or animal models or yeast or even fruit flies. And, not we're actually the big stumbling block into applying this in human health is the technical difficulty of trying to measure autophagy real time at the cellular level in living, breathing people. It's a huge technical hurdle, and that's the only reason it hasn't been applied to dementia and aging and lots of other things.
And so, and is that why you kind of well, I guess tell us the process that you kind of went through. So you obviously figured out that autophagy could be helpful and that fasting can increase autophagy. Is that part of what your process was?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't set out to, I mean, I kind of stumbled on a lot of things by accident, but I had a prepared mind to understand what was going on. And so when I first developed long COVID in 2020, I mean, I didn't even know about long COVID at the time. It was so early.
Hmm.
And I was trying to improve my health desperately. And one of the things, I went through a phase where I rapidly gained 10 or 15 pounds. And so I was like, oh, I hate diets, but I want to lose some weight. And so that's when I started experimenting with like a no added sugar diet. And then eventually that led to doing some water fasts. And I saw dramatic improvements in my symptoms in my first long haul in 2020. And actually, I was fortunate to fully recover. And by the early fall of 2020, I was elk hunting in the mountains with my bow and like going around rugged wild territory for 5 days.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, and then and then I got COVID again. Turned out my brother, who was on the hunt with me, had a new case of COVID, and I
Hmm.
got reinfected. And 3 weeks later, I had my second round of much more severe, much more typical long COVID. And so that's given me a lot of time to self experiment and start the Facebook group and share experiences and ideas with other people.
And so, what kind of fasting did you do to help you resolve that first episode of COVID?
Uh, I actually was fortunate that all I did was time restricted eating. Mostly I did time restricted eating for that first recovery. The no sugar diet and eating in an 8 hour window every day seemed to I mean, after 3 weeks of that, I had a flare up of my head pressure. It was, I don't like to call it a headache because it doesn't really feel like a migraine headache, but it was miserable. And I had about 8 hours of this flare up, head pressure, and then it was totally gone and it didn't come back. So I was like, wow, don't know what happened, but that was a good thing. And basically, that kind of led to my hypothesis that once I learned about viral persistence, my hypothesis that we can do things like short fasts and taking some supplements that cause cell stress and potentially induce autophagy to more strongly trigger the antiviral immune responses. And that's potentially a beneficial thing.
So to clarify, you talked about doing eating within 8 hour period. So essentially, so were you skipping breakfast and then you would eat between 12 and 8, or what
I
would that look like?
a lot of people skip breakfast when they go to like the 16-8 eating pattern, and I strongly recommend against that. There's these circadian rhythms, everything in the body and the hormones and cells operate on this day and night rhythms, and I think we want to encourage those healthy rhythms. And so I think eating breakfast, by 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning is important. And so to choose I now suggest a 9 to 10 hour window because a percentage of long haulers, especially women, seem the 8 hours I think is too restrictive, where they get a flare up of their symptoms almost every evening or every day. So I'm for more general people, I don't think we want to flare up every day. And so if 8 hours is too restrictive, try 9 or 10 hours.
So then they're eating breakfast at 9, and
Well, I
then
mean, it
go
could be
ahead.
7 or 8 or 9, something like that. Yeah. So
And
generally it means having an earlier dinner. And most importantly, I think is not having snacks in the evening.
Mhm.
And what this does is that autophagy is like there's different levels of autophagy. There's something called basal autophagy, which is like this low level, quick pick up the house type cleanup. And that happens, every day, probably every evening and into the night. We're not really messing with that. I think that the short water fasts and some of these other supplements like resveratrol appear to trigger, per my hypothesis, induce this autophagy strongly, mainly in the evening and sometimes going into the night, depending on how strong, you know, how strong it's induced.
So it seems like it's mainly it's kind of eating a normal 3 meals, but yet your third meal is you're done by at an earlier time. So 5 or 6, depending
Yes,
on when you have your breakfast.
yes, exactly. I think that's, I mean, so basically try to eat only in the daylight hours. Don't eat if it's dark,
Hmm. Interesting.
and try to get a little bit of sunlight every day. But even so, I know some long haulers are mostly housebound, but um, just to help your circadian rhythms, I think it's helpful to get some exposure to sunlight. sometime in the morning.
Mhm. And so it sounds like you were saying by doing this you avert the flare because it sounded like there was more of a flare when they had a tighter window. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people can do can tolerate an 8 hour window, but a percentage of the women would have a flare up every evening, or it would just be in a constant flare up with an 8 hour window. And they're going like, is this the keto flow? What's going on? And I think it's just that they're kind of potentially triggering stronger autophagy and, uh, inducing a stronger antiviral immune response, pretty much every day, which is no fun, and it doesn't allow for any time for cellular rest and
Hmm.
rebuilding.
Yeah, and I've wondered too, fasting is stressful on the body, right? And that's part of why it
No doubt.
works in this context. But if it is compromising the adrenals and the adrenals are producing cortisol, which is our body's main anti-inflammatory, then all of a sudden your circadian rhythm is off and then you get more inflammation. So yeah, you have to, oftentimes I talk about like a Goldilocks dose of so many things, whether it's, supplements or whether it's food or fasting. And so for some people, they could potentially do an 8 hour fast, but if they're noticing that it's too stressful, then maybe moving more towards a 10 hour.
Yeah, and not an 8 hour fast. The
Oh, sorry,
eating.
8 hour window. Yeah.
So I like the terminology I prefer is, like 9 to 10 hour time restricted eating. And then you are fasting for the rest of the evening and night, but it doesn't really feel like a fast.
Hmm. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for that. And so, what prompted you then to start the Facebook group?
Okay, well, so I guess I'll go back to my first long haul. I had recovered to the point where I was doing half day hikes in the Colorado mountains, and the next day I would have severe fatigue. I would have to take like an hour nap. I would just be wiped out. And I had no idea at the time that that's kind of classic post-exertional malaise, or PEM. And a lot of long haulers are familiar with that symptom. Some get this abnormal, profound fatigue, even from something simple like sweeping the floor, or, doing some chore around the house. For me, I was able to, do a half day hike and I felt fine. But then the next day, wow, I was wiped out. Uh, and so that's when I did my first fast. And I actually did a four, uh, let's see, a 4 night, 3 day fast. And the first evening that I didn't eat anything, so you know, I, I started basically after supper. And the first evening of my fast, I had a flare up of my symptoms. And I had a new symptom I'd never had before, which felt like, uh, you know, pressure on my heart. I mean, potentially myocarditis or some sort of inflammation in the heart. And it was bad enough that I was like, wow, I think I should I go to the ER and get this checked out? And I chose not to. And, after a couple hours, it subsided. The next evening on my fast, the exact same thing happened, except for the heart pressure was only lasted about 30 minutes. It was a little bit milder. The third evening, it it was, only lasted 5 or 10 minutes and was much milder. And so then the next day I resumed eating, and uh, rested a couple days, and then I went up in the mountains and tried a hike. And to my amazement, I was able to do like a full day hike without suffering post exertional malaise. And actually, I did 2 8 hour hikes 2 days in a row,
Wow.
and I had no post exertional malaise. And I'm like, wow, not sure what happened, but that was probably a good thing.
So then, what are you currently um, I don't want to say recommending. I mean, obviously you had this experience, and I
Well,
know.
I mean, I
Yeah.
do go as far. I mean, ever since I started the Facebook group, which I started because I started talking about, my fasting experience on some of the other long COVID Facebook groups, and a lot of people were really interested, but it made some people really mad. How dare you suggest that these sick people, consider a fast? And some people were really mad. And basically, I got tarred and feathered and got run out of town on one of the largest Facebook groups,
Wow.
even though I was trying to stick only to telling my story in the first person. And so I was like, hey, well, a friend suggested, well, why don't you start your own Facebook group? So that's what I did. And that turned out to be a good thing. Uh, And, I started that Facebook group. I suggested, a autophagy protocol, even though really, none of this is proven. I'm connecting a lot of dots. And I collected some preliminary data, and it was very positive. Uh, People are very variable in how they respond. Not everyone sees decreases in symptoms, but in my preliminary uh, data that I collected, 70% of the people saw improvements in their symptoms. And the best responders saw a dramatic decrease in their symptoms. But there was a wide range on how people responded. And so then I, got fortunate enough to connect with Dr. Jeffrey Novak at Pacific Northwestern University Health Sciences. And I'm like, hey, I really want to turn this into a legit, real clinical trial. I think this is really important. And I said, do you happen to know, have any connections with an IRB? And he said, well, I happen to be the chairman of our local IRB. And that was a good connection.
Excellent, definitely. Yeah, I'm so pleased that you're doing that work. And I know we can't talk about it, so I'll just go back to that
We
first
can't talk
preliminary.
about the results,
We
right?
can't talk about the results, right?
They're
But we
they're
can
being
talk
written
about
up for
the
publication.
we can talk about the methods.
Sure.
Okay, great. Well, let's go first to what you did initially, where you saw that 70% improvement. So what
Well,
were you?
okay. So my preliminary data, was different than what we did in the actual diet and fasting study. Uh, in my preliminary data, I was tracking the number of symptoms, and I was doing surveys in the community to identify, characterize patient-reported symptoms. So basically, it was pretty simple to do to come out. I mean, the CDC has like a list of like 18 or 20 symptoms, but it's not a very good list. And it was very easy to come up with a much better list of patient reported symptoms. And I used that as the basis for the clinical trial, the diet and fasting study, where basically everything is from a patient perspective since I am a long hauler. And I knew that long haulers were really aware of their symptoms and tracking them, and that there's a lot of these flare-ups. And so I kind of designed it with all that in mind. And basically, we captured uh, patient-reported symptoms, 28 of the most common, plus another 30 less common ones that I just call checkbox symptoms, because we made everything simple and easy for someone with brain fog to get through. So people were able to do this weekly symptom survey in less than 10 minutes.
Nice.
So we were collecting the number of symptoms and the severity. And so basically the procedure is to calculate this overall long COVID symptom severity score based on the number and severity of symptoms. And they just get 1 point for the additional checkbox symptoms. But I think it's a very simple and powerful way to, measure someone's overall burden of long COVID.
I agree. And what were they asked to do as part of that, the
As
symptom
part of the
check?
trial.
Hmm.
So what we did is we did have them do. So the idea behind the diet, the no sugar diet, was to kind of help stabilize them, patients, and uh, and also to get them in a healthy eating window. So we had them eat in a 9 to 10 hour window, um, uh, pretty much throughout the entire 10 weeks of the study. But the first 2 weeks, it was just making dietary changes. And also in their enrollment session, I would review their supplements and medications. And I tried not to change any medications, but there were a few that they weren't allowed to take it if they were going to participate in the trial, like LDN, which is a real common one for long haulers. And uh, and so basically, the first 2 weeks were to track their symptoms to kind of get a baseline while they've, recently stopped a bunch of supplements. We had one participant that was taking 50 supplements all at the same time. Wow. And I'd say the average long hauler is taking, 5 to 10 supplements. So, we had their 2 week baseline, and then we had a crossover design. So they do 4 weeks of treatment A or 4 weeks of potential treatment B. And so half the people do A and B, the other half do B then A. So really the power of the study is that people are their own controls, because the exact same person tries treatment A versus treatment B. And we can directly compare the two statistically and see, which is more effective. So it's actually a pretty powerful design compared to the more typical, random, just one treatment per arm design.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically, they would just continue the no sugar diet and eating in a actually it was a 10 to 12 hour window for 4 weeks. That was like treatment A. And treatment B, we narrowed the time eating window to 8 hours a day. And that was not my choice. And I wanted to keep the time eating the same. And then we kept the diet the same. And we added in the once a week water fast. And participants were encouraged to attempt a water fast where basically they can drink water, tea, and take a simple salt water solution for electrolytes, and magnesium glycinate, 400 milligrams per day on the fasting days. And so we were giving them electrolytes to prevent the slim possibility of something called refeeding syndrome, which is life-threatening. It's usually much more of a risk for malnourished people that are undergoing weeks-long fasts. But anyway, we're tracking adverse events, so we wanted to establish if this is safe or not. So anyway, the main difference, other than a slight difference in the eating window, is this once a week water fast or not. And the average, and they could fast for 1 full day or 2 full days. The majority of people fasted night, day, night for about 38 hours.
And so that was in the clinical trial, or that was in the
that was in the clinical trial.
Okay.
In the preliminary data, people could fast for 1 day or 2 days. Again, most of the people opted to fast for 1 day.
And what did you find? You can tell us about the results of the preliminary data, right?
In the preliminary data, it appeared that the 2-day fasting was a little bit better than the 1 full day, but the numbers were not, we didn't have a huge N number, so I'm not, I didn't attempt to calculate statistical significance. So the preliminary data suggested 2-day fast might be better than 1-day fast, but let's just say I kind of backed off that.
Mm-hmm.
All I'll say is nobody knows the optimum duration for a long hauler to fast, and it might be variable from person to person. What I have seen is some long haulers have really severe flare-ups, apparently triggered by the water fasting, usually upon refeeding, sometimes during the fast. And I strongly if people try this themselves, I strongly recommend starting with just a supper to supper fast and seeing how things go. Like, take baby steps.
Mhm.
Don't jump into it with preconceived notions that, oh, a 5 day fast is the way to go.
And was this an assessment for a week, a couple of weeks? Were they doing several of these?
So yeah, the treatment, both of the treatment periods were for 4 weeks. So they did fasts for 4 weekly fasts for 4 weeks, and then another 4 weeks kind of for comparison purposes. So, if I were, it'd be great to do a future trial where we like fasted them 4 times, for once a week for a month, let them rest for 3 or 4 weeks, and then repeated it. But we kind of chose that duration because to do this A versus B comparison, it's not valid if someone's cured, right? So like that's this design applies to people with a chronic health condition. Now, if you cure them in treatment A or treatment B, all the statistics and comparison goes out the window. It's kind of like a sensitive scale, old-fashioned balance scale. We're comparing A versus B, but if it goes like that, you lose the ability to compare the treatments.
In the preliminary data, did you see anybody with complete resolution?
Uh, yes, incredibly, not very many, but yeah, the small percentage of good responders are really, really good responders.
Excellent. And I wonder if it persists, the improvement.
I don't have any data on that. Anecdotally, from talking to a few people, I mean, this is not I want to say this is not a cure. This is a way to potentially reduce the burden of your long COVID. Um, I I know some people have largely maintained their improvements for a year, but
Wonderful.
I've also know of a few people that have uh, not been able to maintain their improvements, and it's all very complicated because given the current KP.3 or KP.2 COVID wave, lots and lots of people are getting reinfected, and that just everything's around the pandemic for long haulers. It's not over.
Right.
It's there's a lot of anxiety about getting reinfected.
Yeah, and you talked about how you had recovery after your first COVID bout, and then you got reinfected and you haven't been able to recover from that. Is that something that you're also seeing in the group?
I'd I'd say as a general trend, yes, that it's harder to recover from your second bout of long COVID. There are I do these informal surveys, and I think I had 8% that reported of current long haulers, 8% reported that they recovered fully from long COVID the first time, and 4% reported that they recovered fully from long COVID a second time. And I think the numbers aren't very big, but it's suggestive that with each bout of long COVID, it's harder and harder your chances of full recovery are diminished.
Why do you think that
That's
is?
what it certainly feels like to me, because my second long haul, again, I was experimenting with a little bit with fasting, but a lot with different supplements such as resveratrol and alpha lipoic acid and L-carnitine, and various things that are known in basic research to stress cells and induce autophagy. And almost every time, I mean, this has like been my hobby for the last several years, like looking at the basic research. Oh, that's what's shown in cell culture to induce autophagy. I think I'll try it. And almost always, uh, those supplements, and usually at the standard doses, on the supplement, sometimes less. Um, I take it in the morning and it flares up my symptoms in the evening, or sometimes not until like day 2 and day 3. So there's some crazy things like fish oil. Even eating like a normal, generous portion of salmon for dinner, I will be in a flare up the second and third day from eating a generous portion of salmon.
Interesting.
And and in the basic research, the omega-3 fatty acids, DHA and EPA, are one of the things that have been shown to cause autophagy. Actually, there's different flavors of autophagy, and those cause lipophagy, where the lipid droplets within the cells get targeted to the lysosome for degradation.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. With salmon, unfortunately, fish can be high in mercury, and so maybe there's a mercury component. Also,
Yeah, although I can take it with cod liver oil, I can take it with algal DHA, and the same thing happens.
okay, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's my hobby, is like trying things to see what flares up my symptoms or not, and it's amazing.
Hmm.
So
Excellent.
I actually have another paper that I'm writing and working on. It's kind of slow going. It's on the back burner at the moment, but it's my Verse hypothesis. Basically, I think a lot of these long haul flare ups are triggered by at least the ones related to certain foods and diet, and some medicines, by the way, as well, are things that stress cells enough to trigger strong autophagy. And I believe that the internal deep cleaning in the cells is degrading some of the viral proteins in the cells and tissues that are affected with SARS-CoV-2. And autophagy is intimately tied into the regulation of innate immunity and antigen presentation. And I think it's like this virus is trying to hide. It's got a lot of tricks to hide from the immune system. And I think my theory is that inducing strong autophagy kind of breaks that, pulls off that Harry Potter cloak of invisibility. So all of a sudden, the cytotoxic T cells and the natural killer cells can all of a sudden go, ah, there's that pesky virus, and they go after it, and you get a flare up of your symptoms.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an important point where a lot of people don't realize that your symptoms oftentimes are an expression of your immune system. It's the indirect, it's the response of the immune system to the spike protein or to the infection.
Yeah, and it's not just the spike protein. So, what? There's a lot of evidence for viral persistence now, and uh, the spike protein is one of the most abundant proteins. It's probably the easiest one to detect. So that's what you see most commonly in the studies. But in the studies where they look for the viral RNA nucleic acids or other viral proteins like the nucleocapsid, they find it. And so one of my favorite studies on viral persistence was, and it's kind of like just a case example for one specific symptom. They it was the University of Maryland study where the Yao et al. Team, they found 16 people that had loss of taste or altered taste. One of the, which is common in acute COVID, but also some long haulers have it. Like roughly 10% of long haulers have altered or loss of taste, some for years. And they did biopsies of the tongue, multiple biopsies over a period of like 6 months. And in 16 out of 16 people with loss of taste, they found SARS-CoV-2 RNA, uh, spike protein, and nucleocapsid protein. So this is not viral remnant. This is very likely persistent viral infection. They also found, local inflammatory cytokines and elevated levels of, I think, T cells. So it looked like an active, ongoing viral infection. And they could look, right next door, or someone that recovered, they could look at their taste buds after they recovered. The virus is gone, the inflammation is gone. I mean, the temporal and spatial correlation was basically perfect. And I think that's, exhibit A for how this persistent virus could be causing a whole host of symptoms, but what the symptom is varies depending upon the cell type and tissue that happens to be infected.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, so essentially, if you've got pain in your muscles, it's because the virus is in the muscles in that particular location.
Yeah, the muscle pains, I'm not positive. There could be other things that cause that, but I think most of the symptoms, uh, like in the gut, there's a lot of and dysautonomia type symptoms. I think it gets in the vagal nerve. I'm really concerned from personal experience. I know this gets in the nerves. Um, I had dental work done a week ago, and I got 2 lidocaine shots in my right cheek. I've been in misery the last week, at least in the
Mm.
evenings, because the lidocaine, uh, apparently, my theory is that it stressed the cranial nerves, near my jaw and my cheek and throat, because I had for me, a severe flare up of my cranial nerves, below the hinge of the jaw. Uh, in the evenings, it was like a migraine headache, but just focused on my temple, which I think is the trigeminal nerve. I had a little bit of eye socket pain or behind the eye socket pain. Occasionally, I have pains elsewhere on the right side. All of the all of this cranial, what I think is cranial nerves flare up was on the side of my head. I had nothing on the left side of
Mhm.
my head. So I was really surprised by that, but I've had a lot of surprises in my long COVID journey. So my hypothesis is that lidocaine is yet another medication, or and there's lots of supplements as well that can flare up my symptoms. But this one was really fascinating because it was such a localized effect, which would kind of make sense with that's probably where the cells and tissues that got exposed to the lidocaine.
Right. Yeah, or it's causing some sort of damage to the cells, and that the virus really prefers areas that are weaker, potentially.
So I don't. I mean, I think there isn't much research on lidocaine and autophagy, but I think a lot of these things can stress out the cells or the mitochondria enough. I
Right.
think it caused really strong autophagy, and I was getting these, evening flare ups of my right side cranial nerves for a week. So to me, it's just another example of what I call a VERX, but a very interesting one because it was so localized.
Mhm. So why do you think that we're seeing this viral persistence? Why do people get long COVID essentially?
That's $1 million question, and I certainly don't have the answer, but I strongly suspect that there's certain genetic predispositions to having long COVID. I, for example, had when I was a young man, I had mono, Epstein-Barr virus infection, probably worse than average. And during times of stress in my adult life, I had it reoccur several times. So to me, that implies that some aspect of my antiviral immunity is not 100%. I mean, I didn't think it was bad, but it wasn't 100%. And so, you know, antiviral and innate or natural immunity is really complicated. There's a whole bunch of pieces to it, but basically, there could be hundreds of genes and everything has to be working perfectly for it to be, 100% effective. And I think SARS-CoV-2 is a virus that is stress testing our innate immunity, and the people that don't ace the test are, you know, more likely to get long COVID.
So essentially, you're saying that, when functioning correctly, our immune system should be able to prevent the COVID virus from taking hold in the body, but for some reason, the immune system is not functioning correctly, it's distracted, whatever it is, and the
Yeah,
virus comes in and takes up shop.
yeah. So there's if you have a version of RNase L, a protein that's induced. I mean, basically, in innate immunity, when cells, and all cells have this, not just immune cells, all cells have innate immunity, and they have these pathogen receptors that identify like bacteria or viral fragments, and they sound kind of the fire alarm. And the way that it's a complex biochemical pathway, but basically it triggers type 1 interferons. And these type 1 interferons stimulate what are called interferon stimulated genes within the cell and also in immediate neighboring cells. And these interferon stimulated genes, there's hundreds of them, are produced kind of like a natural pharmacy of antiviral and antibacterial compounds. So RNase L is one of the things that gets turned on, and that degrades, any viral RNA floating around in the cell, for example. But the SARS-CoV-2 virus, I mean, all viruses have tricks to evade immunity, and otherwise they wouldn't be a successful virus. But SARS-CoV-2's bag of tricks, I think, is especially sneaky,
Mm-hmm.
and it actively suppresses autophagy. So there's multiple steps to the autophagy pathway, and several of the viral proteins actively block key steps in the pathway. For example, there's these vesicles that are like engulfing contents of the cell or damaged proteins or damaged mitochondria. And then it's called an autophagosome, and that has to fuse with a lysosome. SARS-CoV-2 makes a virus that blocks the autophagosome fusion with a lysosome. So, and I think it's doing that because autophagy is so important in, triggering innate immunity and alerting a cell that there's a viral pathogen present.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got a number of other tricks, but it definitely blocks and alters the autophagy pathway as one of its tricks.
Yeah.
So basically, I think it's unusually good at hiding from
Mm-hmm.
people's immune systems.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed is that when we remove some other immune system distractors like heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and other infections like Epstein-Barr or mono, like you talked about, that oftentimes that can help to resolve the COVID symptoms. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it seems like those things are potentially distracting the immune system. Does that make sense?
I mean, yes. I mean, there's a possibility that other latent viruses get reactivated, like mono or other herpes viruses. But I think 95% of what's going on is directly due to the SARS-CoV-2 virus persisting in the gut. And unfortunately, in the nerves, sometimes the peripheral nerves, the vagus nerve, and probably parts of the brain.
Do antivirals, you think those are going to be viable treatments?
But yes, I think this is my prediction is that this is going to go the path of HIV treatments, where it took roughly a decade for them to finally develop and figure out that they needed combinations of highly effective antivirals to pin the virus in a corner so it couldn't rapidly replicate and mutate around a single drug. So I think it's a big challenge for for big pharma. And in the meantime, we got to figure out how to keep ourselves afloat and minimize, the symptom burden as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And another paradigm is hepatitis C, which is chronic infection of the liver. Can be usually completely cured by 180 days of antivirals.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But for example, the first Paxlovid trial out of Stanford was a bust. I think there may have been some temporary benefit from the 15 days of Paxlovid, but they were assaying symptoms only once every 5 weeks. So by the time, they gave 15 days of Paxlovid, and then several weeks later, they checked patient symptoms, there was no statistical benefit. I think that probably there was a transient dip in symptoms, because the person that ran it at Stanford said, patients tell us they feel better. Patients tell us they're getting better. And then when they measured several weeks later, no benefit.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, it appears to me, since I specialize in chronic fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalitis, also known as ME/CFS, that this looks very much like that, where it's just a different infection. And there are a lot of infections that we look at that cause similar symptoms. What do you think? Do you
Yes,
think it's similar, dissimilar?
I think it's extremely similar to ME/CFS, and I'm a proponent that viral infections are, the main trigger or cause of ME/CFS. And yeah, I think I think this is I think modern medicine, even though we have all this technology, it's like we're back in the Middle Ages and nobody knows anything about bacteria, or that bacteria cause disease. The technology just isn't there to accurately assess persistent low-level viruses in the human body. The UCSF researchers are kind of leading the charge on this front, and they have some high-tech assays where they can look and see where activated T cells are, and they light up all around the spine and several other sites in the body of long haulers. So there's a number of studies suggesting there's an ongoing antiviral immune response in long haulers.
Well, Thomas, this has been very educational. I appreciate you taking the time to share this with us. If people want to learn more about this work that you're doing, is the best place to go the Facebook group?
Yes, that's the best place to go. And if you do opt to check it out, go into the featured posts section. So there's a Autophagy banner, and then right below that are the featured posts. And I've got, you can get a good overview of Autophagy and what the group is all about by looking at the featured posts.
Well, I just so appreciate the work that you're doing. You're definitely a pioneer in the space.
Well, I will say it's nearly impossible to get a human trial of fasting approved by an IRB. Dr. Novak and I were fortunate to clear that hurdle, but it was truly a minor miracle.
Well, thank goodness. And when can we anticipate to see the results?
Well, we're doing the analysis and write-up. I'm crossing my fingers that that there's actually a lot of steps to the peer review process and submission, and we don't know if it's going to get accepted by the first journal or rejected, or how hard the reviewers are going to be for us. If all goes well, we might have a paper out there by the end of the year. So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Thanks so much for joining me today.
So if you have chronic fatigue, long COVID, or mast cell activation syndrome, and you're looking for help, check us out at energizedmethod.com. We have a program for almost every single budget, and we're here to help. I hope you learned something on today's podcast. If you did, please share it with your friends and family and leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. It's really helpful for getting this information out to more people who desperately need it. Sharing all the experts I know and love and the powerful tips I have is one of my absolute favorite things to do. Thanks for being part of my community. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. It is provided with the understanding that it does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. Thanks for listening, and have an amazing day.